Well, this past summer, our staff toured the state once again for our annual Economic Update series. And the focus, if some of you made it, it was a fabulous series, and the focus was on the silver tsunami. The silver tsunami that's coming to Montana. Aging demographics and a rapidly changing economy. We're putting more and more burden on our Montana property taxpayers as a result of this. And the question is, can we meet the demands of the new economy with a 19th and 20th century tax system? Today we have a group of experts ready to share their insights on this pressing issue. I'd like to welcome our panel moderator, Bryan Wood, to my right. He is the president and CEO of Wood's Powr-Grip, and he's also a director of the Montana Chamber of Commerce. So with no further ado, Bryan Wood.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's discussion on pretty much everyone's least favorite thing, taxes. No matter what your tax structure is, it's going to be scrutinized, and Montana's definitely no exception to that. For years, the Montana tax structure has been a subject of heated discussion, and actually in more recent years, we're seeing changes to the way some businesses transacted, and that may be resulting in some shifting of the tax burdens. So because of this and a number of other factors, it seems like this conversation about the tax structure is intensifying. Knowing that this is such a hot button, a couple years ago, the Montana Chamber commissioned an analysis of the current tax structure, really trying to get a feel for what the pain points are, especially in relation to business investment. Since then, there's been additional studies done, some from a policy standpoint, some from a budgetary standpoint, all the time keeping an eye on court cases that are creating, or landmark court cases that are changing the landscape of the tax structure nationwide. So with that, I welcome you to today's panel. Is Montana's tax structure suitable for a 21st century economy? I'm pleased to say that we have with us today on our panel 3 thought leaders who just may have some insight into that very issue. So I'm not going to go through their complete bio. It's in the program, but just in short, in the middle we have Becky Beard, who serves House District 80 and has since she was first elected in 2014. From Elliston, her district covers part of Lewis and Clark and Powell counties. She's served as majority whip in her caucus during the 2019 session. Becky will discuss for us the policy committee's approach to the tax structure question. We also are joined by Representative Llew Jones, a longtime legislator who has served in leadership positions in both the House and the Senate. He currently represents House District 18, which covers Toole County and parts of Ponderosa and Glacier counties. Llew will share observations about this question from a budgetary perspective. Finally, we're also pleased to have with us Mike Green, a partner with the Crowley Fleck law firm here in Helena. One of the go-to folks on this topic. Mike's practice includes commercial litigation, administrative and regulatory matters, commercial government relations, and state and local taxation. Mike's going to share thoughts on the impact of the Wayfair decision on the current tax structure. So please help me welcome our guests. We'll begin with Representative Beard, followed by Representative Jones, and close with Mike's remarks. Following that, time permitting, we'll take questions from the audience. So, Becky, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bryan. And I wanted to just say Happy New Year to everybody here. And you know what that means. We are embarking on tax season. So, can I have a show of hands? Who in this audience agrees that this is one of the least favorite things that we look forward to? Do you think? Is that all? The rest of you must be CPAs. Come on, come on. Well, the Legislative Council based on House Joint Resolution 35 being passed in the legislature last year. Legislative Council assigned this tax study to the Revenue Interim Committee, which is undertaking going through this tax system that we call our beloved Montana tax. The committee, during its June meeting, decided to adopt a preliminary approach to this study, and then at our November meeting, proceeded to evaluate in detail the state and local sources of revenue. And you'll hear a lot more about this shortly from Representative Jones, but I just wanted to give you a feel for what we're looking at on the Revenue Interim Tax Committee. We've cited a need to have a comprehensive study of the state and local tax system, which hasn't been undertaken in many, many years. We are addressing our changing economy in the 21st century. We need to take a look at things such as our business climate and internet commerce, demographics, how they're changing, and the requested tax revisions that we're hearing about from constituents and people who are testifying before the House Taxation Committee and the Senate committees to try to make more sense out of our system. This involves looking at property tax relief, matching tax structure to our current economy, reducing volatility, and discussing the pros and cons of tax alternatives, tax options. But we're keeping an eye on the inevitable consequences of tax shifting. And then also being introduced into our conversations are horizontal equity, those with similar incomes having similar tax burdens, versus vertical equity, distribution of tax burdens among those with different incomes. So, as you can see by this slide, this is basically who we have assigned to our interim committee's subcommittee for the HJ 35 tax study. Our interim subcommittee is being chaired by Representative Alan Redfield from Livingston. And we have a great statewide diversity of representation on the committee. As you can see, the names on the slide. From Missoula to Colstrip, of course, Elliston, Kalispell to Bozeman, East Helena, Great Falls to Browning. And we also were served with an option or a great tool to appoint members from our professional communities to also help us on this subcommittee. And we have Rose Bender, who is with the Montana Budget and Policy Center, Eric Bryson with the Montana Association of Counties, Tim Burton with the Montana League of Cities and Towns, Dwayne Iverson, CPA Extraordinaire, Bob Story, Montana Taxpayers Association, many of you know him as well, and Professor Doug Young with MSU. And I'm going to be using some of the data that Professor Young has provided our subcommittee in reviewing our tax structure. We all carp about the amount of taxes we pay, but realistically, are our taxes in Montana too high? Professor Young was able to rank nationwide the states and what the tax burdens are. And then what we've done is fine-tune for our subcommittee neighboring states, regional states, to show just where we are in comparison with our neighbors. And right now, Montana ranks 38th with the obligation of 8.7% dedicated for taxes. South Dakota is on the low end of the spectrum at 47%, and North Dakota is high at ranking number 3, and South Dakota ranking number 47. So, U.S. average of tax obligation is almost $5,000 per capita, and Montana is quite a bit less than that, under $4,000. In our ranks with residential property taxes, we hear a lot about that during the interim and also during the legislative committees. Professor Llew was able to take our neighboring states again and then citing city in each of those states as kind of the representational model for each of the states. Residential property taxes, Billings, taking a Billings home for $226,000. The tax on that is $2,133, ranking us in our neighborhood at the lowest in our group, but 37th nationwide. Sioux Falls, South Dakota is paying a residential property tax rate of 1.53%, making them the highest regional in our region. And then Cheyenne, Wyoming is coming in lowest at 49. Industrial property taxes. And this is going to include real estate, equipment, inventory, and fixtures into this calculation. Again, using site-specific in each of our neighboring states. Billings, Montana has a rate of 1.25%. We're the highest in our neighborhood. And Fargo, North Dakota has 0.47%, making them not only lowest in our neighborhood, but lowest nationwide. The U.S. average is 1.32%. Our overall business tax climate, based on corporate and individual, sales and property, and unemployment insurance taxes, Montana is the 5th best nationwide according to Professor Young's data. Wyoming is number 1, and within our neighborhood, Idaho falls to the bottom. Now, our subcommittee for the study was queried by staff in the Legislative Services Division as to what priorities we want to focus on in this tax study to be able to produce a document of recommendations. And of importance, based on the survey of our members, property taxes ranked the highest. That's what we want to delve into with the most scrutiny. And then individual income, corporate income, oil and natural gas, vehicle tax and fees, insurance, and then gaming taxes. We want to keep an eye overall to assuring Montana's competitiveness in our region and hopefully set an example for others across the country. Now we get into the fun stuff. We have 32 different tax types that we are considering, especially now going into tax season, and this keeps our CPAs very busy, and it keeps our staffers at the Montana Department of Revenue on their toes with all the phone calls they're getting. But of all of these sales and excise taxes, and I'm not going to go through them individually, I'm sure a lot of this information is familiar to all of you, and if you need to go back and review it, we can talk about that shortly. But we have, the first slide that I showed you was natural resource tax related types, alcohol and beverage types, and then we have our miscellaneous types. Again, 32 different tax types. This list does not include other miscellaneous fees, fines, taxes, including local options tax and resort taxes. But these are things that, being in business, being in commerce, we are keeping our eye toward. Okay, a little bit more fun here. And this gets into the real crux of it, and I'm sure Representative Jones is going to have a lot to expound on shortly. But our tax classifications, we have 15 different tax classifications, and we are generating the taxes paid in 2019 just under $1.9 billion in revenues. We have classifications that I've highlighted, the 4-point series, residential and commercial. Those 4 classifications alone generate 65.8% of the tax revenues collected in 2019. Now, we have a population of just under or just over 1.74 million people in the state of Montana right now. In 2010, we had 989,000 people in the state. We're generating an increase since 2010, an increase in revenues, 49.5% more than we did 9 years ago. Our population, again, was under 1 million. Now we're just over 1 million. Our population increased 8.5%. Our revenues increased 49.5%. The associated pie, and this is the information that our legislative fiscal division provides us with in the revenue-related committees in the legislature. And as you can see, the biggest chunk of the pie here is the residential improvements in the brown, 37%. Non-electrical general property tax of electrical utilities is at 14%. Commercial improvements at 11%. Ag land is 5%, commercial land 5%, business personal property 5%. And as you can see, the pie from 2010 really doesn't look much different. The percentages paid by tax classification are relatively the same. However, going back, for instance, the gross proceeds metal mines, classification 2, generated 0.5% of the revenues in 2010. They now generate 0.82% in 2019. Non-electrical general property tax, number 9, 2010 was 11.4%. Now it's at 14.23%. And railroad and airline property tax generated in 2010 2.1%. Now it's 2.64%. So we've got, not a lot of change in our pie charts, but we are generating 49.5% more in revenues now than we were 9 years ago. So that would say that that would indicate that we have better revenue generating now than we did 9 years ago in 2010. And we are still paying similarly the same percentages. We're just able to generate more money because our economy seems to be doing better. So, what's next in the HJ 35 tax study? Our next meeting is next Monday. We're going to be doing a deeper dive into property tax basics, evaluating property tax data, and then possible revisions based on some of those items that I mentioned earlier. To recap, our study mission is set forth by the 2019 legislative session. We aim to promote a tax structure that works with our economy, our 21st century economy, to stabilize revenues while reducing the volatility, to promote long-term economic prosperity, and to establish sound tax policy to include simplification, competitiveness, efficiency, and predictability. Our subcommittee and the Revenue Interim Committee will be finalizing our documents in September and then transmitting them to the legislature for recommendations in the 2021 legislative session. So with that, I think that's my presentation. Thank you.
So Llew, you're up. Thanks, Becky.
So talking taxes, right? The taboo subject. I often wonder, because I get invitations to come and talk about taxes to groups that hate taxes. And I think I must be a sadist because I hardly ever say no. We come and we talk taxes. I guess, so anyway, we are participating as well. I tend to look at it from the service point of view as well as the tax side. Because if you think about it, government collects taxes to provide services. And we have to separate what government sections provide what services. Effectively, the property tax entirely, except for 6 mills, goes local. The 95 mills that is collected, more than that is redistributed out in part of the GTB school equalization formula. And so property tax is local, cities, schools, and counties, and income tax is the state. That's effectively how the system works. And when you look at your local folks, they're providing you water, sewer, a variety of goods. Primarily the discussion there was because your number one item was property tax, and the property taxes have increased, and income tax. So we're going to go through this generally because I wanted to look at what the growth rates were for critical services, both at the state level, at the local level, and then forecast it 10 years forward and see what kind of revenue it was going to take. Because if we're going to cut taxes, we're going to have to cut services, right? It's as simple as that. If I say, does everyone want to cut government spending 15%? Everyone says, absolutely, let's cut it. I say, all right, run to your community and let's get rid of 15% of the services. Well, not in our community. Well, let's identify 15% of things we can do more efficiently. Where? Well, okay, let's turn 15% over to the private. What 15? And so everybody wants to cut 15% or 30% or 20%. But when you ask them to change the cut into the services they want to eliminate, the world goes quiet. And so let's talk through this a little bit. In total, this is just a general slide, actually, that shows taxes are down in Montana. Overall, the tax burden from 2000 to 2005 in Montana in a percentage basis has decreased. Right? Federal is up, fees are down. That's just mathematics. Taxes are down. So it's not overall taxes that's getting us, is it? We have a tax concentration issue happening. Total taxes are dropping. So if we go to the next screen, what you see is while our overall taxes are low, when you compare us on things like property tax relative to the median in the nation, we're high on property tax relative to the rest of the nation. We're high on income tax relative to the rest of the nation, to the median point. Now, because we don't have a sales tax and the other, we overall are low, but it's not overall, right? It's the property taxpayers that we're talking about. Again, another Doug Young slide I stole, actually. And so in this one, I actually want to have come up in front of me so I can talk through it a little bit. So I think I wanted to make sure, and this number has updated because you've got 19 data and I didn't have that in yet. But basically, we're paying now about $1.8 billion in property tax. This slide shows 1.5 because I didn't have the newest numbers, but I just wanted to have folks talk about where stuff went because we have to understand it. So to begin with, the K-12 schools are not controlled by the state. They're controlled by the elected trustees, right? That's who controls the schools, local control. We love local control. Counties control the county property taxes, elected commissioners. Cities, via elected aldermen, control the city taxes. And the state redirects, so we got counties, cities. The state redirects its mills back to the schools, so only property tax the state actually keeps is 6 mills. The state doesn't run on property tax. The state runs on income tax. And so ultimately, when you look at it, we have to keep in perspective who pays the taxes and then who controls. Legislators have limited control of the spending on the property tax side. The spending is controlled by the local entities. That's just the way the tax system works. So I've heard this, the Chamber's been a champion of it, a lot of folks have been a champion of it. They say, we need to eliminate the business equipment tax. So I want you to think about it. Let's say your cities, your counties, and your schools, and I agree, I run a lot of business equipment, are spending 1,000 units. And so if we eliminate the business equipment tax, right, we eliminate the $85 million that is the business equipment tax. What happens? We didn't change the $1,000 that are being spent. We didn't change anything. We just decided that other people need to pay, right? Because automatically we have a floating mill. So the residential mills across the state will go up 40, and all the other classes go up automatically because the school's still spending what the school spends, the city's still spending what the city spends, the county's still spending what the county spends. And so we have made a payment decision. Now maybe it's the correct decision. Maybe that's the right thing to do, but we need to understand we didn't cut anything. We just decided someone else should pay. Now our challenge is that across the state, business equipment isn't distributed evenly. So in Carter County, if our business equipment tax, it obviously doesn't have any business equipment. Its mills didn't change at all. In Musselshell, you just added 140 mills to the other classes because we didn't cut anything. Cutting property tax does not cut spending. You have to be willing to identify those spending items if you're going to cut taxes and talk what services you're going to eliminate, provide more efficiently, or transfer. And if it's property tax, it's not the state. The state can choose which category pays the property tax, but it can't control the level of the property tax. That is controlled by the local control we all celebrate every day. Okay, so let me see if I can get these two things to coordinate because I can't see that far to see where the other one is. Decreasing property tax, there we go. So some of these slides now you've seen. We just went through this. Basically, overall, if you we don't rank too badly on a national level. If you put us on the total tax scale, as Representative Beard said, we're fine total taxes. We're just concentrating taxes in a given area. So now, property taxes go local. So let's talk about the other side. The state runs on income tax, right? If you take a look at the state of Montana, it basically runs on income tax. If you don't count the property tax that transfers through it, 71% of all state spending is income tax. The state is not a property tax consumer. It's an income tax consumer. So now and we know certain things on the state level, right? So property tax goes local. Let me get all these things through here. So let's talk a little bit about the income tax. Income tax is incredibly variable. We have to have a rainy day fund. When you look at our income tax, we're not actually as relatively high on income tax as we are on property tax, but we're still higher than some states because we don't have a sales tax. Okay. So how is the elephant in the room? I've heard it over and over and over again. It's state government. State government spending has blown up the system. Rein in the state. Efficiencies and waste, right? So we need to first talk about overall state spending. Where does the state spend? So if you think about state, if you think about any spending, and the bottom line on this chart is CPI, it's a rate of growth of inflation, and it's population. So if you think about a snowplow, this next year the tires for a snowplow are going to go up by the rate of inflation. They're going to go up for your pickup as well. Right, so you would understand that no matter what we do or service we provide in government, it's going to go up each year by the rate of inflation. And in some areas in local government, sewer, water, and road inflation is real high. The top line on this chart is personal income. That's the growth of the underlying economy in the state. Bottom line's about a 3.1% slope. The other one's about a 5.1. They're about 2% apart. The line in the middle is state government, and that's the combination of general fund and state special. And I'll tell you the difference between the two. But first off, I'll tell you that the state government's not very near the personal income line. It runs closer to CPI and population. The difference between those lines, of course, is any new services folks ask for from the state. So since I'm usually accused of blowing things up, I put on when I got in the legislature because that's when you expect to see these huge increases, right? Me and Nancy balance, we're no longer conservatives. We've blown up the earth. Well, if you look at the charts, they don't tend to support that. While we like to wax eloquent as politicians about out-of-control government, at the state level, it hasn't grown out of control. Now, we need to split stuff up a little bit at the state level. Make sure I got the chart up. The state actually has two lines, right? It's a general fund line, which we directly control, and it's a state special spending line. So the general fund line actually runs at CPI and population. Not a big surprise because schools are 50% of where we spend our money, and their formula is CPI and population. So the general fund's pretty low. The state special revenue is higher. It's a higher line. Again, I put on when we came in, we did see that in 9 when I got on approps. We started sunset and stuff. We got it flattened. We finally got the state special below the line. But you got to remember what drives the state special. Okay, so what happens to us is things like initiatives. Folks, state special is special designation, special revenue, special source. You pass an initiative and you say you want to do children's health insurance, and it says we spend X, and we spend X. You pass an initiative on tobacco funding and says we do Y, we do Y. And so some of the biggest drivers, and you can see the other drivers, it's gas tax, it's all those other fish, wild, special source, special deal. But when we get a lot of impacts on our state special from law changes that we don't control. The big hop in the beginning of that chart was actually those two initiatives. So where does the money go? And in the state level, 91% leaves Helena. The state spends 51% of its funding on education. And education is across the state. The rest is between health and human services and public safety, law, and justice. That gets you to 90%. The vast majority of that hits our local communities. So we're going to slash government spending. Well, we cut 3.5% in the special session, and the local communities came unglued. Their throat was being cut, they were being destroyed. Because we're a balanced budget state. So if we cut on one side, it immediately passes on. Again, I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. But the money is used to provide services. You have to begin with the services and hold a discussion of that which you want to reduce. Otherwise, you're transferring tax. FTEs have exploded in state government. Really? Well, I can't see it, right? We had that big run-up in the beginning, and I'll show you where that came from. That was the acquisition of the public defender in the court system, where we took on from the locals, the courts. In 2009, we went flat, and in the last several years, we've cut 380 FTEs. The state itself runs fairly frugal. Now, we got to talk about some of the other sections here soon, and here is the public defender coming on, right? That adoption of the courts and the public defender has been a significant increase for the state. I actually am very concerned. I know it had to be done, I guess. We lost some lawsuits. But once we separated the spend from the judges that can decide what we spend on, our spending went up at a rapid rate, and so has our FTEs. We seem to have defenders appointed for about everything, right? Somebody for the grandma, somebody for the kids, somebody for someone else. We are struggling with controlling our rate of growth on our courts. Education, our biggest spender, also FTEs going down. So finally, when I put the next two on there, there's the federal line. Federal use in Montana still is operating between the personal income line and CPI and inflation. You can see Medicaid expansion coming on. Still did not take it above the personal income line. In fact, because it comes from the federal 90-10, it actually was a net increase on income coming in. Now, what we're still waiting for, and we'll have by this next week, legislative week, is the local line, right? The county, city, local line. Data is going to show, and I know where it'll generally be, it'll be higher than both the other two lines. Local government will have grown right at the personal income line. It is growing, and that's not necessarily bad, right? Because the CPI for water, for sewer, for roads is higher than a standard CPI. There are some provisions of additional services, but via the additional of the extra districts, et cetera, the biggest drive has been local. It's why you're feeling it in your property tax more than your income tax. And again, we have to talk about it in terms of services, because I doubt your aldermen or your commissioners are very happy trying to take people's money. It makes them angry, but they probably do want to put tires on the snowplow, and they want to make sure when you flush your toilet, something goes away. You might be angry with them if it did not. So let's see here. So again, direct taxes, family auto. Again, I wanted to show we are a progressive system. Another Doug Young side. You actually aren't. If you look at overall Montana and you're not owning something, you're not in a bad tax bracket. So what is our bottom line here? Out of control government, that's a repeated soundbite. Well, I tell you what, if you look at the data doesn't say that's true at the state level. Growth in state government, the 91% goes local. It's been close to population and inflation. Growth in city government, it'll be available in January here real soon. It's likely going to be somewhat higher. We're going to have to hold a discussion and to forecast it forward, and we're going to have to hold a real discussion of what services you want to continue or discontinue there. Federal government, it's still in between the lines right now. As long as the feds do their share, the expansion has been a net positive for the state budget. There has not been a spending explosion. Now, when 715 is complete, the MARA is complete, what I hope to be able to do out of this is I want to take the state spends, the local spends, and all of them and forecast a model 10 years forward based upon the past. And then we want to take a discussion of what revenues are going to have to look like to support that. And I think what you're going to find is your property tax is going to go flat out of control unless we hold a discussion that something else has to be added to the system. You know, it's truthfully where we're going to find ourselves. A little bit of why. We'll touch this personal economy chart. Some of you have seen this. Our Montana economy is growing faster than the U.S. That's why personal income is as high as it is. Our challenge is that we're growing in 5 counties. 75% of the growth occurred in 5 areas. So we have the haves and have not. The rural is not growing at all. You know, you've got, and you know, Missoula, Gallatin, Lewis and Clark, Flathead, and Yellowstone. Los Angeles is responsible for a ton of our growth. That's not bad or good. It's just we've got to consider this. We're also not growing in the traditional economy. We're growing in what I call the services economy. If you take a look at the traditional, which is down on the bottom of the chart, it's flat, right? So you're seeing the Netflixes, the Amazons, you're seeing just regular service position. The world has changed. Now, we're really good at taxing bushels of wheat, barrels of oil, tons of coal, square footage of buildings. We're not really good at taxing the signal that goes into your phone. You know, I want you to think about it. Today, in 45 out of 47 states, I believe it is, and this will probably be in the end deal, we're going to be Amazon e-commerce is being taxed. So when we send a good, Montana sends a good via e-commerce there, we help pay for their water and their sewer and their goods, their public services, their schools. When they send a good to us, well, we help subsidize them. We pay for the roads they drive on, the airports they fly into. But it's okay. We're going to continue to do this with one less flower shop paying property tax and be surprised the property tax goes up. You can't reduce the number of property tax payers and not concentrate the tax unless you're willing to reduce the number of services. All right. I did want to point out that one of the things happening in Montana is non-labor income. We're seeing a divergence from the gross state product to the personal income, and I think what's happening, we're seeing retirement move in, Big Sky, some of the areas. You are seeing a big factor, a significant portion now has become non-labor income. You know, that's a big factor in our state, and so that's one of the discussions we'll have. You know, we often hear some interesting things. We have to cut our taxes on our retires folks. So let's see, I don't disagree with that. After all, I want to cut my taxes on my very wealthy mother so that my 18 to 20-year-old kids can pay more. Because we haven't cut spending. The single poorest class is your young group. Your single wealthiest is your older group. We have to look at the data when we hold this conversation. Maybe that's a good decision, but we should be data-driven. Let's see here. I wanted to point out that our traditional economy is in that little circle. We are damn good at taxing our traditional economy. A lot of that circle isn't there anymore, is it? We have to hold this discussion. I'm going to argue we're out of balance. This is a right thing that shows the rate of service growth in Montana, and that we're going to have to. We have a tax equity problem. You know, this slide, another one of my favorites. Now I can't get this slideshow to go forward, so I can match them up. But if you take a look at this slide right here, what you can see is the growth of non-labor and services in Montana since 1970 to now, and the growth of the traditional economy on the bottom, and which one government's hooked to. We are doing a good job of taxing the traditional economy. We haven't recognized where the puck moved. And while we may not want to hold it, I'm not saying Montana needs more money, I'm saying that we need to consider who it is. We're fine if we could be revenue neutral today, but I do believe our residential property tax and that is going to get out of hand unless we're willing to hold a true discussion of where we might need to be. Any number of these I just wanted to show for you. Uber and Lyft versus rental car and taxi. How would you like to be rental car and taxi today? But again, let's think about it. Rental cars had sites. They pay W-2. They pay property tax. Taxis pay for medallions. They participate in the services. Uber and Lyft, well, they do participate some, but not nearly at the level of those that they're displacing. Biggest hotel system in the world, Airbnb. You may like or dislike this hotel, but it pays for employees. It pays for all sorts of goods. W-2, property tax, pays for the water, the sewer, etc. Airbnb, well, we've all stayed in them, I guess, or at least I have. I know they always tell me, make sure you call us direct next time so we don't have to go through Airbnb. Well, now, why would they want to do that? They already don't pay much bed tax, but let's just call us direct. You know. How about Walmart? Walmart, state's largest employer, by the way, is Walmart. 400 stores in 2016, still had a sales decline. Pays Montana property tax and other taxes, right? Pays for the water, the sewer, the schools. You know, let's see if I get that all. Pays for water, schools, and schools. Now let's compare it to its friend Amazon, right? Net sales increases, revenue per employee, you just can't compete with it, right? There's the Amazon growth curve. I've got nothing against Amazon. They have a fascinating model. You locate your headquarters where you don't pay income tax. You locate your distribution where you get a property tax break or there's no property tax. And up until this Mayfair decision, you distribute it in all the states without a sales tax. It's a great model. More power to them. Wish I'd have done it. What I would hope that we think about is that maybe they need to participate in helping pay for the water, road, and sewers. We can't keep going back to the flower shop for $1 more when it sells less flowers. And then we come up with great ideas like, let's do a local options tax in an area and tax even more the flower shop and the local folks to help pay for goods. Make them even less competitive with the e-commerce, putting them out of business. I don't know. I think we might need to discuss whether our tax system is equitable. Again, on a neat visual chart, I like people to look at this because, you know, if you look, normally I can point at it, but if you look to kind of the green in the front that says farming, mining, and forestry, there's your traditional economy. We're good at taxing that one. What about the big service block on the chart? What about the other areas? We might have a tax equity problem. I think we do. I believe that's what this study will show. Not that the state spending's out of control, and I think the locals, when they understand what they're spending and doing, will always line up. No one wants to be out of control, but we are going to drive our property tax through the roof unless we change. And we used to be, and I like this chart, we used to almost be a three-legged stool. We had a natural resource tax that acted like the third leg. Property tax, income tax, natural resources. This is what, whoops, where did it go? This is what happened to the natural resource leg. Natural resource leg is now a stump. You see things like coal strip that are happening. And in truth, you just see the growth of the urban relative. So the stump's not quite as big as it used to be. It is concentrating taxes on the other two. And since the income tax doesn't change, it concentrates on the property tax. You know, like this slide shows that oil and gas is 1% of the jobs, 1.7% of the jobs, 1.9% of the income, 4% of the gross domestic product, and pays 12% of the taxes. Could we be overtaxing our traditional economy? I would suggest maybe yes. Finally, when I talk about the concentration on the residential property owner, the actual tax burden decreased from 4.5% to 3.9% between 95 and 2019, but the relative share paid by residential property folks went up from 1.5 to 2. It's concentrating. Couple thoughts on income tax. We have folks that want to increase the income tax. Well, I hate to say this, but the state border is permeable. If you increase the income tax, people will build income tax producing assets elsewhere. They can't move their mine, they can't move their oil well. You'll hurt the concentration, but they can move their tech shop. They can move their bank headquarters. So we just got to talk about who pays for the water and sewer and what services we want, the schools. We need to have a realistic conversation on who pays for these items. Yellow Cab versus Uber, Airbnb versus Marriott, Netflix versus Blockbuster. You know, high tech and finance can locate anywhere, but our traditional natural resource center cannot leave the state. You know, again, we're good at measuring lots of things in the old economy. We're not very good at measuring things in the new economy. Bottom line, I predict the data will show that Montana's tax system needs updating. The traditional economy is being overburdened. When politicians talk about slashing government spending, I am so tired of two things. Let's slash government spending, but let's not identify what we're going to do. Right? Don't tell me what you're going to cut. They need to identify what doggone services there are. I have heard that for 16 years about we have to slash this, but I've never heard anyone say, okay, but we want to reduce the number of ambulances, fire trucks, and water lines. We just heard a discussion at the beginning of this. We need more infrastructure. Taxes less. But we want you to invest in infrastructure. With what money? We have to be realistic of what we're asking for. Tax changes, I do believe, should be revenue neutral. I believe today that if we do a system, we don't need more money, but we do need to take a look at what we can buy our property tax down with and our income tax even at some level, but in particular our property tax, so that we redistribute the burden so the new economy participates. If we don't do this, if we choose to do nothing, then we will have property taxes continue to grow out of control. Do we have the political will to do it? I've never seen there been political will to do anything unless there's a crisis, right? Because the safest thing for Llew Jones to say is, I'm here to cut your taxes, but not your services, just your taxes. And I don't know how you do that. So that's about as radically transparent as I can be. Don't know what's interesting slides. Time's allowed. Well, so I have some slides if time's allowed, but I got the red flag a while back, so I don't think time allows.
Thanks, Llew. A round of applause for Llew, please. Some final thoughts from Mike.
Well, so I'm the lawyer of the group, and I will try not to bring as much passion as Representative Jones to this process. But one of the things I want to talk about is kind of the dirty word that no one up here has said yet, which is the sales tax. And as we look at trying to rebalance and re-equitize taxes in Montana, I think that is a conversation that we need to have. The reason I think it's really relevant right now stems from a United States Supreme Court decision that came out in 2018, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Before I move into that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself so you understand who I am. But more importantly, I want to celebrate. As you'll notice up here, we've changed our logo. It's our firm is now celebrating its 125th year of providing legal services to Montana businesses, and we're very proud of that. In that time, we've spread out. We now cover 3 states, Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. We have about 170 lawyers spread out among 11 offices in that. Some of my partners are in the room. Many of you know Amy Grimales. Many of you also know Greg Dorrington and Wiley Barker. Wiley Barker is one of my partners on this state tax journey that I've been on for about 20 years. I started out litigating cases against the state of Montana when I was a baby lawyer back in 1999. We've now branched out and we litigate cases against the state of North Dakota and the state of Wyoming. And we also provide information and advice to businesses throughout Montana on dealing with their state tax challenges around the country. And then and businesses from around the country dealing with their state tax challenges in our neighborhood. I want to talk today about this Wayfair decision. It relates to sales tax, but I am going to tie this into why it's important for Montana businesses, and I will also tell you that this is one of the issues. These Wayfair decision issues are one of the issues that we are getting lots of calls about. There's lots of interest. Every conference we go to in the country, this is a huge issue because it goes beyond just the sales tax space because it's a U.S. Supreme Court decision that affects all areas of business life and most predominantly other types of taxes. As we talked about the silver tsunami and we talk about these need to rebalance, I think this issue of how out-of-state businesses are taxed in Montana and how that compares to how Montana businesses are taxed in other states is a really important discussion. Unfortunately, I have more questions than answers today, but I want to provide you a little bit of a legal framework for how we get here. So this all comes out of two cases out of the Dakotas. State tax cases are very rare that they go to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's about once every 8 or 9 years that you have one. So it's really odd that we've got two tiny little states in the Midwest that have two of the most significant tax cases in the last 30 years. It started in 1992 when the United States Supreme Court reaffirmed an older case that related to states' jurisdictions over remote sellers. At that time, this was a mail order catalog business. The Quill Corp is an office supply company, and they were selling and shipping. They were the biggest office supply company in North Dakota, but they didn't have any employees, warehouses, or other property in North Dakota. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1992 reaffirmed a decision from 1967, which said if you don't have a physical presence in your state, that state cannot require you to collect sales and use tax. If you read the Quill decision, it's about a 30-page decision. If you go through that, it's one of those decisions where you think, okay, you read all the way through, they go through all of the problems with why a state, with allowing a business like Quill to escape tax, talk about how it's an arbitrary distinction. They go through all of this analysis of why it is that really it would be okay for North Dakota to tax Quill, except that under this notion called stare decisis. That's the precedence, U.S. Supreme Court, that's the big Latin phrase that lawyers love, which says, court, you can't change your mind. You made a decision in 1967, you have to stick with it. And under this notion of stare decisis, they said, okay, we're going to leave in place this bright line rule because we think it's good for the national economy that states are prevented from taxing companies that are just selling into your state but don't have any property or payroll located there. In 2016, the state of South Dakota their legislature declared a financial emergency. They'd seen a significant erosion of their sales tax base. I think you probably saw on some of the slides that Representative Beard put up previously, South Dakota does not have a state income tax. And so they have a two-legged stool. It's just it's two different legs than we have. And so they're heavily reliant for state funding on their sales tax. And so this erosion of sales tax related to remote sellers was a huge issue for them. They declared a financial emergency, and they passed Senate Bill 106, which really was a remote seller tax. They, in doing that, simplified their statewide sales tax. They provided for kind of prospective application only, but this bill was specifically designed to create a challenge of the Quill decision. It was immediately challenged upon passage by three huge remote internet sellers, Wayfair, Overstock.com, and Newegg, Inc. This was a hotly litigated case. It went to the South Dakota Supreme Court, rejected the upheld the taxpayers' challenge, declared the Senate Bill 106 as unconstitutional under the Quill decision, which was frankly a no-brainer decision. It was accepted very rapidly by the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled Quill's physical presence requirement and determined that Senate Bill 106 was a permissible assertion of state authority. How did we get there? I want to provide you, because we're in Montana, some of you are probably familiar with sales and use taxes, but one of the underpinnings of the Quill decision was there's a use tax. So sales taxes are always accompanied by a use tax, and what that says is if your seller doesn't collect a tax, then you, as the buyer of that property, are required to report sales. So for example, if you're a Wyoming resident, you come to Montana and buy a car, take that back to Wyoming, you're required, you don't have to pay Wyoming sales tax, and you didn't pay sales tax in Montana, but you have to pay use tax to the state of Wyoming. Well, as you can imagine, you have to go license a car, so those kinds of sales are getting picked up. Some businesses have to report, property tax on business equipment, but the vast majority of those transactions which are occurring in the use tax arena are not being reported. All of us are, obviously in Montana, we would all report that, but all those people, all those tax cheats in the other states were wildly underreporting their remote purchases. And so the states basically just said this notion that the use tax is making up for the sales tax is not valid. And this issue was pretty simple from a legal perspective because there was no dispute about whether or not the transactions were taxable. They were all occurring in South Dakota. Everyone, clearly the buyers are taxable. And a sales tax is a tax on the buyer. It's just collected from the seller. So the issue in Wayfair was whether or not South Dakota could require those remote sellers to act as a South Dakota tax collector and collect tax, which South Dakota residents undisputedly owed on purchases they were making in the state. Under Quill, the answer was absolutely not. They had no physical presence. They didn't have any property or people in South Dakota, and so they couldn't tax. Now, 40 states, 40 states filed briefs in support of South Dakota's position and supporting the expansion of sales tax jurisdiction. Montana was one of 2 states. Montana's Attorney General Fox, supported by John Binion and Dale Schoengert, filed an amicus brief with the U.S. Supreme Court opposing South Dakota's position. General Fox and his team argued that businesses in Montana were going to be severely impacted by the Wayfair decision. They expressed concern about businesses in Montana who are remote sellers don't have the infrastructure in place to collect a sales tax. So South Dakota businesses or Wyoming businesses selling into South Dakota already have a sales tax system, right? A point of sale system to collect that tax in place. Montana businesses do not and did not at that time. And they pointed out that really overruling Quill and removing the physical presence requirement in favor of some line to be drawn in the future created significant litigation and expense risk for businesses. Unfortunately, the General Fox's arguments did not carry the day, and the court overruled the South Dakota Supreme Court and overturned Quill and National Bellis Hess and removed the physical presence requirement. I want to talk a little bit about this decision because it was a little bit unusual. It was a 5-member majority. It was authored by Justice Kennedy, who's certainly not considered one of the more conservative members of the court, and it was joined by Justice Ginsburg, who certainly is not among the conservative majority. And in fact, the chief, Justice Roberts, penned the dissent, and it supporting stare decisis. What's interesting, I think most interesting about the case are the concurrences. There was a concurrence by Justice Thomas and a concurrence by Justice Gorsuch, who was a relatively new member of the court at that time. Both of them, I think, were telegraphing some developments to come in the tax space. So this, I'm going to get a little bit tax wonky on you because it's important, I think, to understand where we're going to head in the future, and that the U.S. Supreme Court, I don't think, will any longer be a reliable check on taxing jurisdictions and states' abilities or desire to expand their taxing authority. I'm going to come back to why that's important in Montana. But both Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch concurred in the decision to overrule Quill, but they went further and said that the dormant Commerce Clause, which is the judicial doctrine that says that the courts have the ability to rein in states and to be a check on states' authority to interact and to interfere with interstate commerce, really are misguided, and that the U.S. Constitutional Commerce Clause is an affirmative grant to Congress. It says Congress shall have the right to regulate, the authority to regulate commerce among the states. The courts have interpreted that to say even where Congress has not acted, the courts can interpret that clause as being a restriction on on states' authorities. That's very important. Now, the Wayfair court left in place an old case called complete auto transit. And that's a case that set forth some standards for what a state has to do if it wants to tax out-of-state businesses. But really, it is a significant erosion. And I think telegraphs, as this court continues to evolve in the future, it telegraphs some challenges for businesses ahead. Just to tie this out, the court really went back and said, Quill was a mail order business. Folks, they were shipping catalogs in. People were placing phone orders. This is a very different economy. And they noted that there have been far-reaching systematic and structural changes in the economy since Quill was decided in the 1990s. They talked about Wayfair and Newegg having these ubiquitous websites, ads coming up every time you open up Google, and just how that access to a market has changed fundamentally. Interestingly, the dissent didn't really support, they said, basically National Bellis Hess, if we were going to make that decision today, we wouldn't impose a physical presence requirement. And nobody thought it made none of the 9 justices thought that standard made any sense. But what they said is, they have more, I think, maybe a little bit more faith in our congressional leaders than some do, but they said, what we said in Quill is if the Congress doesn't like this physical presence requirement, it should go in and exercise its Commerce Clause authority and fix this. The dissent said they haven't done that in 30 years, so why are we going to mess around with that? That did not carry the day, and as I indicated, they've overturned that. What was interesting is that Wayfair was a groundbreaking and earth-shaking decision in a lot of ways, but it really resolved one very small issue. So under complete auto transit, there still is a 4-prong test for what a tax has to be. This case addressed only one prong, and it was that physical presence requirement. So what everyone forgets is it really was not a win for the taxpayer or for the South Dakota in this state. The U.S. Supreme Court remanded it back to the courts in South Dakota to further decide what would happen. But the taxpayers at that point saw the writing on the wall, understood what was going to happen. They settled out that case. What's happened since then is every state in the country that has a sales tax either has imposed or is in the process of imposing a remote seller tax regime that tries to comply with Wayfair. I talked about, there we go. So where does that leave us? We're back to, as I indicated, this complete auto transit test. And this is really important. This is the guidepost, and it's important in Montana. It's important for Montana businesses because in order for a state to tax non-residents or to tax businesses that don't operate in those states, they still do have to satisfy these Commerce Clause tests which the courts have left in place. There has to be some contact, some substantial nexus with the state. The tax has to be fairly apportioned, meaning it has to only be a tax on the activity that's connected to that state. It can't discriminate against interstate commerce. I'm going to come back to that because that's important for Montana going forward. And then this one's a little weird. It says it has to be related to the service that a state provides. When you have an excise tax, like a sales tax, which is on the value of a transaction, that one's pretty easy to meet. This related to services provided becomes a little bit more difficult when you start trying to go into an income tax. But the courts in this arena have not done much in the space of taxes being fairly related, and they've really deferred to legislatures. But as legislatures consider how to address these issues going forward, that does become a policy consideration for them to undertake. Why does this matter in Montana? Well, it matters for a lot of reasons. The first and most direct is for clients like ours, members of the chamber, some of you in this room. It's subjected you to either additional tax collection responsibilities Or if you've decided not to undertake those responsibilities or to carry out those responsibilities, it subjected you to the potential for risk in the future. So that's compliance cost. That's the cost of actually implementing and complying with the tax. But if you decide not to do that, it's the risk that at some point you're going to end up paying your customer sales tax, because it's not a defense to a sales tax audit that, oh, I didn't know and I didn't collect that tax. The states will say, well, you should have, and now you have to pay. I think going forward, the Wayfair decision and some of the discussions and articles that have been written about that provide us policymakers in Montana a roadmap for what we can and can't do if we decide to impose a sales tax in the future. It also provides a roadmap for those things that we really can't do if we decided to try. So that one of those issues is we're not going to be able to selectively target some of these remote sellers. If we're going to try to do a transaction tax in Montana, it's going to have to be general and broad-based. We can't just pass a tax that goes after these remote sellers selling into Montana. And then I think for folks like me and for policymakers, this also will inform decisions about what we can do in other tax areas, including income and business activity taxes. Now that's going to inform decisions other states as well. So again, from my perspective, this has opened the door to other states taxing Montana businesses. And it has created an opportunity for us to treat those remote sellers into Montana in a similar fashion, but it creates, like I said, it's an opportunity and a challenge here. Right now, we're only getting the challenge aspects of this because Montana businesses are bearing the burden of remote sales taxes from other states, and we're getting no benefits of those incoming sales in Montana. There's been some discussion. There were some articles written at the time Wayfair came out, I think anticipating that public policymakers in Montana might move towards a sales tax, and they've said, no, we shouldn't do that. Montana should just undertake ways to protect Montana businesses, put up borders, create ways to challenge these taxes, challenge California taxes in Montana courts. Well, that whole notion has just been this fall was soundly rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so Montana businesses, if they're worried about California or Washington sales taxes, are going to have to go and fight those battles in those states. The Montana courts and Montana policymakers are not going to be able to protect our Montana businesses against that. There still are, I think the notion was that Wayfair maybe just removed all constitutional constraints on application of this law. That it didn't really do that. As I indicated, it decided one very narrow issue, and we still have a substantial nexus. So the standard now is that a business must avail itself of the substantial privilege of carrying on business in a jurisdiction before it's subject to tax. Now it's really not as clear as you got to have people and property, but there are some guideposts around that. And I will say, as the next slide, that states are taking that to heart. It can't, as I indicated, you still cannot discriminate against interstate commerce. So you can. So most of these states have created a little bit different. They've created a tweaked sales tax regime for remote sellers, and that's because you can't expect a remote seller to collect every local sales tax, every little city or school district, all of those local option sales taxes that are added on. So most states have adopted some mechanism by which remote sellers can pay to their state. So for example, in Texas, I think there's about 289 different taxing jurisdictions, all with different tax rates. There's something like 32,000 local taxing jurisdictions in the United States assessing different tax rates. And what the Supreme Court, they didn't hold this, but what they said is probably that's not going to be reasonable. You can't unduly burden commerce. But what South Dakota did is they created a remote seller tax, which is a statewide tax. A lot of other states have created a tax, which is basically kind of an average of their high and their low tax rates. And the local jurisdictions have to give up some some benefits or some of their flexibility in order to kind of get the remote sellers to do that. They also don't, one of the things that allowed the court to uphold the South Dakota law was that it was not retroactive. So South Dakota wasn't trying to go back and collect tax. It was, it only applied going forward. And there's now been a whole bunch of litigation about whether or not states can actually go back and tax. And so that's something for for businesses in Montana to be mindful of, is what happens if you start to file in a state. So as I indicated, most states have now undertaken remote seller tax. And if they haven't, they either have legislation pending or administrative rule changes pending that are going to do that. A lot of them are undergoing this simplification process, which will take a little bit longer. And as I indicated, they're not taxing everyone. So Attorney General Fox's concerns about small businesses, at least I think, are being adhered to a little bit as states impose this, as most of them have put in place some kind of a threshold. So I pulled some of the big heavy hitters that we know Montana businesses are dealing with. In California, you have to have $500,000 in sales before you become subject to their remote seller tax. Idaho's $100,000, North Dakota's $100,000. South Dakota and Wyoming are both $100,000 in sales or 200 separate transactions. There's been some criticism of that transaction-based sale, and I would suspect over the near term, those transaction-based thresholds will go away, but currently those are in place in Wyoming and South Dakota. And then Washington, which is another heavy hitter for Montana sales, their threshold is $100,000. Washington has a really weird act, so if you're doing business there, you should take a look at what their requirements are, because they have some notification requirements that kick in if you have 10,000 in sales in their state. What do we suggest? Normally I suggest call your lawyer early and call him or her often. In this case, I think you probably need to reach out to your accountants. Wiley and I are really good at kind of advising you about how to fight with the state. But as far as devising a compliance strategy for you going forward that meets your business's needs, we suggest you call your accountant. You should take a look at your sales. You should figure out where you're selling into. You should figure out whether or not, if your goods are taxable in those states, or if you're providing services that are taxable in those states. You should then be consulting with an accountant or a software vendor that can help you comply. And then the gift that keeps on giving is, once you start filing sales tax returns in a state, you should expect that their Department of Revenue will then have you on a very special Christmas card list, and you will be getting a call from them on other taxes. And so that's another thing you're going to want to talk about with your tax preparer. I just want to close out with a couple of other issues that we should be considering. And I think you've heard this from today, but I want to try to pull this together. Montana businesses are being severely impacted, particularly local retail and retail businesses are being severely impacted by competition from remote sellers selling consumer goods into Montana. Those remote sellers are not paying any tax here. So those remote sellers and their customers are escaping the tax that are being paid by local businesses and their customers. At the same time, other states are increasing their burdens on Montana businesses selling into their markets, where we weren't collecting and having to remit sales tax, where we weren't having to pay accountants to file California sales tax returns. Montana businesses are now having to do that. And they are aggressive in their pursuit, particularly on the West Coast, because they really are trying to maintain fairness for their local businesses, because they've seen the same kinds of erosions. Where in Montana, all of the slides that the prior two presenters showed you, we're trending exactly the opposite way. Our taxes on Montana businesses are increasing at the same time where their share of the overall economy is decreasing. And I will just say to you, the residential property tax rates don't tell the whole story here. Our residential property tax rates in Montana are very competitive, but they are underpaying relative to their market value. So our residential rates overall in Montana have climbed significantly, whereas the taxes that they're paying have not kept pace with that. With that, that's all I have. Bryan, I'm happy to answer any questions about.
Thank you, Mike. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, we can do a couple questions.
Okay, I got to stand up. I can only see half the room. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I think we got Kim and Bridger's evil twin.
Might just be me, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Evil Bridger. So the question I have is, if you went to a remote seller tax, that would be a state-level collected revenue source. To buy down property tax becomes a local, because that's where the property tax assessments are set for local services. So how does the state distribute revenue from a state revenue source back down to those local communities if the local communities are the ones that vote to spend? How do you do that?
I know how I do it. You can say how you do it.
Well, I think there's lots of ways to do it. One of the easiest ways to do it right now is that Representative Jones referenced the 95 mills, which we're already distributing back to local communities and local school districts through our base funding, the school funding model already. So one very easy way to get state collected sales tax is to just push that back, just change the funding model, eliminate the 95 mills, and change that funding model. That's instantaneous property tax relief for everyone. The other way to do that, I think over the years in Montana, we have a long history of backfilling every time that we make a change in the property tax system. So our legislature is very creative at ways from getting money from the state back down to the local governments. I think that's probably one of the easier challenges. I think the bigger challenge is making sure that local communities maintain their ability to self-tax, which is a huge component of Montana right now.
And I would entirely agree with that response as well. I'm not sure I would use the 95 mills that would directly take care of that because of the self-tax. I would never want to end up in a Wyoming-like situation. The state in the most trouble upside down today is Wyoming because they have a single resource tax. They're bleeding from everywhere, them in Alaska. Their only way to rescue themselves is to have coal boom again, which it may or may not. And so because they got caught without any local taxing ability, they trapped themselves in a bad situation. Libby is very much in that area, in that problem now. And so I'm often concerned with those scenarios where we don't ensure that the local has its tax base. But there's a number of ways. The 95 mills, you could simply adjust the charge rates, the taxable value percentages on any whatever classes you wanted to apply it to. There's a million. Redistributing it statewide, if you wanted to touch the residential property tax, you could say, okay, we're going to change the number to half that's going to be pulled everywhere and backfill that half once you calculated it. So we've moved money around, not always wisely, but for a long period of time.
Any other questions?
All right, I might have one just real quick for both the legislators up there, because you bring some unique perspectives because you represent two different committees that are tackling a lot of the same questions. Do you have any, I guess if I could get some sense from the both of you, how House Bill 715 budget study and HJ 35 tax structure study, how those complement each other, or do you or any of the legislative staff have fears that it might have completely different results that might suggest totally different things? Where's the collaboration, I guess, at this stage?
Certainly the two committees will start working together come January. The database, the finance committee was pulling the database. Basically, we were trying to get the data very clear. We don't have a clear view of what the local governments spend on, where I can give you this nice pie chart that shows where 91% of the state government goes local. I can't tell you what percent of the water is spent on sewer statewide. And the state's split up into at least 4 rough regions, right? You have your rural declining, kind of the area I come from, which is people are moving out. You have your rural increasers, which is Hamilton. You have your urban flatliners, that's the Butte and Great Falls, generally, and then you have your urban growers, led by Los Angeles. And we need to see how where they're spent. In order to talk about how we can touch stuff, we got to be able to see what they're spending their money on, and then be able to forecast it forward. Once we get our forecast forward 10 years, assuming that sewer is going to increase at the rate, water, etc., we can then take whatever revenues we're receiving and forecast them forward and compare the models. And you'll be able to see, unless there's a change in the service provision or the rate of growth of the service provision, which would require changes at the local level on the property tax, we can say these are the number of dollars you're going to need in 10 years, and this is what your tax rate will be if you choose to do nothing. Or we can also say, well, you got income tax here, property tax here, maybe there should be something in the middle that has bought those one or, one, the other, or some combination of both down 400 million. We're revenue neutral on a given day, and we can move forward. The challenge you have, it's political. If everybody signs no tax pledges and they come up with all these items, and then they say, well, I'm okay on the buy down portion of the property tax, but I'm not okay voting for the thing in the middle. Well, now you don't cash flow, now you can't provide the services. So, the backfills we can do, the argument of whether it should be the 95 statewide mills, which was a Sherlock court decision, we can do all of that. But the bottom line being over here, I think why did South Dakota do it? I wonder, I've been chairman of finance in one form or another for a while, both in the Senate and now back in the House as vice chair. And so I go to a lot of the fiscal leaders and the tax leaders meetings across the state. So I was there before Quill, what happened before Wayfair's, and because South Dakota is a very similar demographic to us, few less people, but very similar to us, and they were looking at their sales tax collection, they figured that their e-commerce penetration was at that time between 20 to 25%. That was costing them 20 to 25% of their sales tax, because the more rural the state, the more the penetration. And they either had a drastically changed model, or they couldn't afford to make their system work. So if you assume the rural state of South Dakota, which looks very much like the rural state of Montana, is similar, that would suggest that we have a 20 to 25% penetration of e-commerce that's not only not participating, as was suggested over here, it's now costing us. We're paying a tariff to other states and receiving nothing. It has become somewhat of an untenable position.
Well, we've been hearing a lot about tax shifting in a lot of different, in various vernacular, but one of the things that I'm really curious about in looking over the data from 2010 to current is we have a very large increase in the amount of spending. And my background, my day job is a water and sewer consultant, grant writer, funding administrator. And I started out with projects. I work for rural communities across the state, and I've been up in Representative Jones's district doing projects. And I see some of my former clients here. What I can say is when I started doing the water and sewer industry work for municipalities, a typical sewer project for a small community would be about $750,000. Now we're looking at $3.75 million to $12.5 million. And we've got a lot of drivers in the industry and our regulatory agencies driving up the costs of these projects, high-tech, green projects. We need to be paying attention to our environment. But my priority has always been for the public health, safety, and economic development for the communities that I'm working in, that they can qualify for some of these grant programs and low-interest loans to help them keep their costs for their improvements to a minimum. And I just have to think that we're spending more and more to address the regulatory climate. And I want to assure that our residents, especially the ones near and dear to my heart, the rural communities, are getting the biggest bang for the buck, instead of governmental agencies recommending that these people should just give up the ghost and move to town instead of staying in their own communities. And the people who live in these small communities are a lot of rural people who are farmers and ranchers, and they choose this way of life. and they choose this economy for themselves, this way of living, for a reason. And I say that's very indicative of who we are in Montana, aside from the 5 major communities who are growing exponentially and do have the tax base to pay for their improvements. So even though we're looking at a property tax study and protecting from shifting the cost, too much to one industry or one taxpayer specifically, I'd just like to keep an eye the whole time on some of the things that Representative Jones is addressing, and it's just the cost to our communities in what we're allocating to cover our day-to-day living. We've got a lot of hurdles, a lot of priorities to deal with, and we are doing our best to cut taxes where we can without reducing the services. Thank you.
I think that puts us at our time limit. Is that right? So could I get one more round of applause for our panelists, please?